I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life by Michael Ignatieff, Chapter 9. Isaiah's War, Washington, 1942 to 1945. Berlin's prize service for the Ministry of Information had proved so successful that he has now asked to do the same for the Foreign Office, working after the British Embassy in Washington. The Anglo-American alliance was at its apogee. American democracy was mobilized on the Allied side at last, and two great leaders were working in concert. Berlin was accelerated by Churchill and Roosevelt's appetite for the future. Their sense that they were prepared to let the wave come in the full confidence that they will ride it triumphantly. Washington was filled to bursting with corner site, huts, and temporary buildings, plywood office complexes, painted wartime gray or green to house a new army of war workers. The whole city surged along on the wave of war. There were something like 3,000 British officials in Washington. Half of the Oxford Bridge common rooms were serving in some capacity, and the old formalities of the British and American bureaucracies had been broken down by the influx of outsiders like Isaiah, and so he quickly felt at home. The weekly summary of American opinion gave him a license to meet everyone who mattered, and he moved out into the overlapping worlds of wartime Washington with a social acumen that his colleagues at the embassy found astonishing. He was soon lunching with the major editorialists and columnists, Marquis Charles, Joe Pearson, Arthur Crook, and Walter Lippmann. With Lippmann, he engaged in grand, formal, and elaborate tours de horizon, which, while global in scope, always seemed to bypass Palestine. Lippmann was sensitive about any subject that might engage his troubled Jewishness. Isaiah quickly mastered the logic of newspaper leaks in Washington. If Crook was carrying a story about the Department of Labor, Berlin knew the material had been leaked by a rival department. He knew which secret sources worked for which columnist, which were reliable, which not. Washington, as his friend Chaim Weizmann wrote, was a regular whispering gallery, combining all the disadvantages of a great capital and a small village. Rumor and gossip are carried on invisible wings, with a speedy and lightning rapidity, and in most cases distorted. Berlin became Britain's ears in the whispering gallery. Government departments, he soon discovered, were as aloof from each other as Oxford colleges. Professional relationships, on the other hand, were highly personal. In Washington, you worked for Mr. X, or Mr. Monganto, or Mr. Hall, which tended to make people indiscreet, since personal loyalties cut across institutional ties. Oxford connections also helped to open doors. Felix Frankfurter provided introductions to key figures in the White House. Berlin made friends with a circle of the brightest young New Dealers in Washington. This circle included Catherine and Philip Graham, then just taking over the Washington Post from her father, Eugene Meyer, Charles E. Bolen, aristocratic and highly intelligent State Department official, who was to be Roosevelt's interpreter and note-taker in his meetings with Stalin. George Kennan, another key State Department official specializing in relations with the Russians. John Ferguson, a young Washington lawyer, then working for the Department of Justice. Donald Heath, a State Department official. John Oakes, an official in intelligence. And Edward Pritchard, a jovial and preternaturally quick young lawyer from Kentucky, former clerk of Felix Frankfurter's, and now a member of the White House staff. Some of these men roomed together in a house called Hockley, and Isaiah was soon a fixture of dining parties there. Prick, as Pritchard was known, was a corpulent figure who joked when he was conscripted that they had reached the bottom of the barrel and were now coming for the barrel. Later in the war, when Pritchard returned from the army, he and Isaiah lived together in a rented house in Georgetown. Through these friendships, Isaiah gained unrivaled access to some of the most influential and certainly the levelest policymakers in wartime Washington. The Alsos connection opened all the doors in the embassy. John Foster was a legal consular, and the ambassador himself was a former fellow. Lord Halifax was vice-regal and remote, a being not of this century, who regarded most of his staff as Foreign Office pen-pushers. But he was unexpectedly warm with the very junior official from his old college. In addition to Halifax, there was another Alsos fellow, Robert Brand, a senior partner in Lazard Forest, in charge of the British Food Mission. In the winter of 1942, Berlin was invited to join a Washington lunch given by Jennifer Brand Polk, Bob Brand's daughter. He was warned that he would meet an absurd Central European adventurer who was bound to be a dreadful bore. Instead, he found himself sitting beside the 24-year-old Countess Patricia de Bowden, who turned out to be the daughter of Lord Queensberry and a relative, therefore, of Oscar Wilde's June Homo Fatal, Lord Alfred Douglas. Patricia's husband was then a prisoner of war in North Africa, and she had come to America with her daughter and had enrolled at Radcliffe in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Isaiah found her wildly attractive, deep blue eyes, a gamey face, framed by soft brown hair in a page boy cut, physically slight and delicate, seductively feminine. Like most society women of her time, she had no education to speak of, but she was highly intelligent and had a taste for clever men. It was obvious that she was not in love with her genial and inconsequential husband. And then Isaiah asked her why they had married. She said, "Oh, because everyone else was so awful." She was from London's smart side, but she seemed bored by its smartness. At Radcliffe, she was busy reinventing herself as a serious person, listening to F.O. Matheson's lectures on Henry James, taking cello lessons, entertaining Harvard professors in her apartment. She spoke well, Isaiah remembered, about Bach's unaccompanied cello suites, which she said were her favorite pieces of music. She was incorrigibly flirtatious, and Isaiah found it intoxicating to be the object of her attentions. By the end of lunch, he felt himself succumbing. She invited him to spend the weekend in her flat in Cambridge. Nothing happened physically, he recalled. She found me as unattractive as everyone else, but she clung to me for some reason. She wished to keep me. He was soon included in the circle of clever Harvard academics who danced attendance upon her. He found her conversation entrancing, her gaiety and sense of humor irresistible. Quite soon, he was in love for the first time in his life. Throughout the rest of 1942, he spent weekends with Patricia in Cambridge and saw her whenever she came to New York or Washington. Isaiah's friends found the relationship hard to fathom. This plump, jolly intellectual with a little severe fare, so obviously besotted with a notorious feminine fatality. She so sexual, he so repressed. He so Jewish, and she, as one of Isaiah's friends put it, so super Gosimo. She at least enjoyed the flattery of his attention. When he was away, either in Washington or back in London for consultations, she was sure to send him a tender note, pulling him back to her. But he quickly realized that she was unreliable to a maddening degree, making appointments and then canceling them, declaring herself his and then vanishing for months into some secret affair. If she was a deceiver, she was also irresistibly forgivable. The affair, if that's the word for such a frustratingly unconsummated business, continued throughout 1942. By the summer of 1943, when Patricia fell in love with someone else, the affair passed beyond infatuation into something approaching real misery. The object of her attentions was a rich young Franco-Cuban graduate student at Harvard, Jacques Abreu, extremely handsome. Berlin remembered and almost completely humorless. In December, Patricia, Abreu, and Isaiah went to see the musical Oklahoma in New York, and afterwards returned to the hotel, where Patricia and Abreu's rooms were next to Isaiah's. As he tried to sleep, he could hear the muffled sounds of love coming through the walls. Next morning, when he checked out, he took the key with him. He held on to it for the rest of his life. In May 1944, Patricia's husband escaped from the prisoner of war camp in Italy and fled to Switzerland, from where he sent a message calling her home. Remorsefully, she returned to Europe after D-Day, but continued to send Isaiah letters that adroitly maintained him in a state of suspended animation and hopeless expectation for another year. Fortunately, his work consumed him. Instead of being tied down to a specific file or area of expertise in the embassy, Isaiah was free to range across all of official Washington, lunching, dining, gossiping, and once a week assembling the materials for a digest of American opinion to be sent to the Foreign Office, and through them to other Whitehall departments, including the Cabinet Office. To the survey section of the British Embassy came reports on public opinion from the British consulates all around the country, as well as the weekly press summary from New York. Occasionally, Isaiah would venture out of Washington and New York. He did visit Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Portland, and Seattle. But America he really knew stretched from Midtown Manhattan to the Potomac. Isaiah absorbed all of this material and then would dictate a digest in his own vivid and pungent language. He had begun dictating while doing the revisions of his Mark's book, and for the rest of his life it remained his preferred method of composition. Dictation overcame his inhibition about the written word, but it taxed his long-suffering secretaries. They had to tune their hearing to the highly compressed, word-swallowing, intricate, clause upon clause flow of his thought. This rough version was then edited, and some of Isaiah's more indiscreet pieces of gossip were accessed by senior officials before being signed and sent out under Halifax's name. Only on one occasion, at the very end of his time in Washington, did the ambassador personally alter Isaiah's dispatches. It was a piece assessing the new president, Harry Truman, and it included the remark that Congress was likely to get on better with Truman than with his more imperious predecessor. Halifax's hand shot out like a snake, and his pen struck out the words more imperious. The words referred to Roosevelt, but Winston Halifax explained would take that as a reference to himself. The range of Isaiah's sources and the quality of the information he was able to extract from the inmost recesses of the American government impressed his superiors. Occasionally, however, he would be taken to task for some startling assertion. "Is this true?" they would ask him. "True," Isaiah would nomically reply, but at a deeper level. An official version of his summary was cabled in cipher to the Foreign Office in London, while a letter incorporating all the gossip found too dazzling by the twilight denizens of Whitehall found its way to Isaiah's friends, chiefly Herbert Nicholas, at a Heartbreak House, the Ministry of Information. These letters became known as the bootleg version of the dispatches, and themselves began to attract attention. This was a dangerous game, and Berlin had to caution Nicholas about distributing them too widely, since American friends were beginning to complain that inside information they had told him was reverberating back to Washington. The circulation list of Isaiah's official summaries was small but select. The summaries were certainly read by Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Information, senior levels of the Foreign Office, senior ambassadors and cabinet ministers. They also reached the king. The voracious appetite for Washington political intelligence was one indication of the increasing subservience of the British towards American opinion. It now became a crucial factor to be weighed, investigated, and reported on before decision could be made, and Isaiah became its chief British purveyor. No wonder his stock rose out of all proportions to his relatively junior rank as a first secretary. He himself was scathing about the new British tendency to wait until it was known which way the American cat would jump. In one of his bootleg letters to H.G. Nicholas, he insisted that the British should make policy whether or not the Americans could be counted on to support it. Palestine was the subject on which the British government waited with a particular attention to see which way the American cat would jump. After the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, when Palestine itself lay open to Rommel's North African army, American Zionist leaders began demanding that the British allow the creation of a Jewish fighting force. Isaiah's reports on this issue make clear that he had not been reduced to silence by earlier reprimands. He reported that the simplicity and humanity of the demand that Jews fight as Jews had won many allies in the States. The British government's arguments against a Jewish fighting force had been rebutted too often in the Zionist press to retain any plausibility. Only Weizmann's influence, Berlin argued, had prevented American Jewish circles turning irrevocably against the British position. Isaiah used every dispatch to bolster Weizmann's position in British eyes. On 9 June 1942, for example, Isaiah consoled Halifax that the British government would be well advised to make any eventual concession in the form of a concession to Dr. Weizmann personally. Halifax forwarded just such advice to Churchill on 27th of June, and these initiatives led to the formation of a Palestine regiment in August, which, however, cruelly disappointed Zionist hopes because it was nothing more than a glorified home guard. Throughout this period, Weizmann's influence on the American Jewish community was waning. In April 1942, at a meeting of Zionist organizations at the Baltimore Hotel in Washington, a declaration had been passed, largely at Ben Gurion's insistence, which formally protested the British ban on Jewish immigration to Palestine and committed the American community to campaign actively for a Jewish state in Palestine at the war's end. Weizmann's policy of seeking concessions from the British had got nowhere, while Ben Gurion's policy of direct challenge to the British was in the ascendant. Berlin was never in fair weather friend, and he stuck with Weizmann. Whether he left Washington to return home to England in August 1942, he was carrying messages from the chief for the Jewish Agency in London. When he returned to America in September, he brought Weizmann the latest news from headquarters. At this point, illness brought them still closer. Isaiah was struck down with pneumonia on his return and had to be hospitalized in New York. He was so weak that his legs felt like a very inferior synthetic rubber. Isaiah's chief concern was to keep his mother in the dark about his condition, so he sent a stream of a cheery telegram, flourishing monotonously well, physical condition superb, and passed off his pneumonia as a minor bout of sinusitis. He was in fact immobilized throughout the autumn of 1942. Although he still managed to dictate political summaries from his New York hospital bed, the Weizmanns joined in the mendacity front, sending Mandel and Murray reassuring messages of their own. Weizmann himself, worn out by the battles with Ben Gurion and discouraged by rebuffs from both the British and the American governments, had been hospitalized for exhaustion and spent the autumn recuperating at a Grosvenor's resort in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Isaiah joined them there, and the old man, now 67, and Isaiah 34, took strolls in the woods and rested on the porch of the Weizmann's cabin. Mayor Weisgall, one of Weizmann's intimates, joked to his chief that he was bound to get plenty of rest, since Isaiah could be counted on to do all the talking. In January 1943, after a long convalescence, Isaiah returned to work, having confessed to his mother that he had been rather more ill than he had led her to believe. His curious double act resumed, advising Halifax on how to cope with the Jewish lobby, while simultaneously advising Weizmann on how to handle Halifax. Weizmann, for his part, used Isaiah to keep the British Embassy informed of his dealings with the State Department. Weizmann proposed to Sumner Welles of the State Department that the Allies pay the ruler of Saudi Arabia a substantial sum in return for his help in forcing the Arabs to concede a Jewish state. When Berlin reported this démarche to the Foreign Office, they reacted with fury. Weizmann is a child in these matters, Harold Corsia of the Foreign Office seized. It was absurd to suppose that Ibn Saud could be bribed into granting a Jewish state. Eden, the Foreign Secretary, energetically concurred. Creating a Jewish state in Palestine would lead to Arab uprisings, which would make those of the 1920s and 1930s seem like bagatelles. In April 1943, Eden secured Churchill's approval to inform Weizmann through the embassy in Washington that he was not entitled to stir up American Jewish opinion by repeating pro-Zionist remarks which Churchill had made to him privately. If Weizmann received this warning, he chose to ignore it. In May 1943, Isaiah informed the Foreign Office that Weizmann had told him it was impossible for a progressive minority like the Jews to be ruled by a backward majority in Palestine, and that the sooner the great powers forced the Arabs to consider this, the more easily the problems of the Middle East could be resolved. In his report, Isaiah let his own opinions momentarily appear in a glancing reference to the narrowing policy of the MacDonald White Paper of 1939, which had clamped down on Jewish immigration. Foreign Office officials annotated this report in as an exasperation. Quote, Dr. Weizmann always repeats that the Arabs would acquiesce if they are told that they must accept Jewish immigration, but that simply is not true. We have been warned that an explosion in Palestine is inevitable. When it occurs, it will be due not to the narrow policy of the Malcolm MacDonald, but to the intransigence of Ben Gurion and his like. End quote. Isaiah never saw these confidential minutes, but he was continually aware of the anti-Zionist bias of the officials who were reading his reports. By the summer of 1943, the direct threat to Palestine from Rommel's troops had receded, and Zionist underground organizations resumed their clandestine operations. The British administration in Palestine became increasingly alarmed at the prospect of a colonial insurrection there. Isaiah was sent confidential intelligence assessments of Jewish underground activity in Palestine and was asked for comments. He found these assessments both anti-Semitic and nonsensical. On the one hand, they maintained that the Jewish must not be allowed to form a Jewish brigade to fight on the Allied side, because Jews were hopeless fighters. On the other, they must not be armed, lest they turn their guns against the British. His loyalties were tested to breaking point in the summer of 1943. By then, the British government was becoming increasingly alarmed by the twin impact of Jewish agitation in Palestine and the Jewish lobby in America. The embassy in Cairo reported Arab concerns about the Jewish pressure on British policy, and when British military moves to interdict illegal arms shipments to Jewish underground groups in Palestine were shelved because of fears of an outcry in the States. Adam became worried that the British policy was being immobilized by the American Jewish lobby. American oil interests in Saudi Arabia also had reason to be worried about the growing influence of Zionist organizations in Washington, and put substantial pressure on the already strongly pro-Arab State Department. In May 1943, Aden laid a memo before the British cabinet outlining his concern that the Arab countries might not continue to support the war effort. If the result of a victory was a Jewish state in Palestine, in June 1943, the American ambassador in London expressed the same concerns to the British government and proposed that Roosevelt and Churchill issue a joint statement condemning Zionist agitation and insisting that the Palestinian problem be deferred until after Allied victory. Isaiah heard rumors of the proposed joint declaration in early July from Nahum Goldman, Weizmann's adjutant at the World Jewish Congress office in Washington. Berlin was genuinely shocked. Indians were agitating for independence for the subcontinent. Poles were clamoring for a free Poland at the war's end. Why should Zionist agitation alone be placed under a ban? Isaiah decided to act. He secretly informed George Becker, a Zionist newspaper publisher, of the proposed declaration, and Becker immediately informed Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury. Having tipped off the Jewish lobby, Isaiah told Halifax, much to the ambassador's consternation, that the news of the declaration had leaked out. Meanwhile, Morgenthau went to the president to demand cancellation of the declaration. Roosevelt played for time and asked a senior advisor, Sam Rosenman, to consult with the British and with Jewish groups. Rosenman came to Isaiah and asked whether he could appease Jewish anger about the proposed declaration, to which Isaiah piously replied that he was of no possible use, if only in virtue of my official position. As Isaiah expected, Jewish groups raised a howl of protest, and by 8 August, the State Department had informed the British government that it had withdrawn the declaration. Halifax, having informed the Foreign Office that the Jewish lobby was to blame, then asked Isaiah to establish how they had found out about the declaration and how they had been able to mobilize opposition within the administration so effectively. Isaiah now had to tell the Foreign Office a version of events that would conceal his own part in scoopering their initiative. His summary artfully told the story as a French farce and as an amusing case study of how rumor ricocheted around the whispering gallery of Washington politics. The deliberately light tone of his report had the desired effect. It helped to conceal his own part in the play. He may have told the story as a comedy, but he actually spent sleepless nights worrying that he would be found out. He had managed his conflict of loyalties with agility, humor, and a certain amount of cunning. But when he had to choose, he had chosen his Jewish loyalties over his British ones. The episode troubled him. Long afterwards, when he might have wanted to reveal the part he had played, at least to Jewish audiences, he remained silent, until he confided his role to me in a conversation at the end of his life. He always strenuously denied that the Jewish problem of a double allegiance had ever haunted him. But it had, and if he had once entertained thoughts that a Jew might work happily in the Foreign Office, the experience of 1943 cured him of that illusion for good. For the rest of the war, Isaiah became the soul of discretion on Zionist matters. As proposals for eventual partition of Palestine began to be put about in late 1943, he reported on Weizmann's and Goldman's reactions. Shortly thereafter, Weizmann had a meeting in London with Churchill and the War Cabinet. Thanks to Berlin's summaries, Churchill could read the version of their meeting with Weizmann choose to circulate around Washington. According to Weizmann, Churchill said that he remained a staunch pro-Zionist, that he could not forget how little the Arabs had contributed to the British cause in this war, and that he would presently plunge into the pie and extract real plum. He then turned to Attlee and said, "The Labour Party, at any rate, is committed to Zionism, isn't it?" Whereat Attlee is reported to have nodded and added that his people would be even more enthusiastically against the white paper if the Jews did not praise them quite so much in Britain and America. Attali's remark might have been seen as an ominous warning of what was in store for Zionism when the Labour Party got into power in 1945. But for the moment, the storm signal was not seen for what it was. As the war progressed, Isaiah's dispatches became ever more assured, personal, and even peremptory. On D-Day, for example, he met Rabbi Shower, the chief spokesman for Jewish matters in the Republican Party. Silver wanted the American government to confront the British and force them to grant a Jewish state. In his reported version of their conversation, Isaiah cleverly used Weizmann's name and prestige to put over the Foreign Office position. I reported to him that no decision on Palestine would be published or implemented before the end of the war, and that Weizmann was himself somewhat opposed to partition, but in any case felt that the American government would never take a lead in settling this problem, but would probably beg the British government in whatever it undertook to do in Palestine, and that, therefore, Zionist pressure in the U.S. seemed to him largely useless. And when it reaches the pitch of 1943 and 1944, damaging and harmful, since it provoked and irritated the British officials in London, with whom he dealt without deflecting them from their policy. Playing one Zionist leader off against another in the service of His Majesty's government earned Isaiah high marks from his superiors. On the margins of this report, a Foreign Office official wrote, Dr. Berlin, 30, love. Berlin, in fact, became convinced that the Foreign Office was exaggerating the strength of the American Jewish lobby. In a 1944 dispatch, he argued that Zionists have made little headway in enlisting widespread support for their views, either in the press or in public opinion. He knew privately that Roosevelt was much less pro-Jewish than the Jewish community assumed, and that there was no pro-Zionist momentum whatsoever within the administration. On Palestine questions, he argued, HMG could proceed resolutely to implement whatever course of action seemed to it desirable, without excessive fear of repercussions on the part of the American public. End quote. If the White Paper policy due to expire in 1944 was changed, then the right public relations policy for the British government was to split the front, to isolate radical Zionists by dispatching eminent British Jews like Lord Rothschild to talk to the leading moderates. With these figures safely in the British camp, the British government had nothing to fear from either the American administration or the Jewish lobby. Berlin's argument, though music to Foreign Office ears, alienated Zionists themselves. Blanche Dugdale, an important supporter of Weizmann's, heard Isaiah give a talk on American Jews' opinion at a meeting in London in early 1944. He maintained that the Zionist forces in America made a great deal of noise but lacked influence with the U.S. administration to force the British hand. Dugdale let him know through Louis Namier that she found his talk supercilious, cynical, and not spoken like a Zionist. In his mortally direct manner, Namir concurred. Years in embassy circles, he told Berlin, tended to dissecate one's style and petrify one's feelings. Isaiah's double life had become unconvincing. I will stop here, and we'll read the rest in the next reading.